I'm Dr. Sarah Reiner. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm going to be talking today about suicide prevention, risk assessment, and safety planning. So I first want to point out some of the statistics on suicide that are pretty difficult. This is one area that I think is really important for all clinicians to know, but also in the church for friends and family just to know some of the risk factors and know kind of how to catch it a little bit sooner. Suicide is actually the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. And there's different risk factors that show that someone might be more likely to attempt suicide or complete suicide. So we'll look at those throughout the next 45 minutes. Actually, age is a pretty big factor. It's the 4th leading cause of death for adults between the age of 18 and 65. It's the 3rd leading cause of death among those 15 to 24 years old. So definitely working with adolescents and young adults, it's something really to keep an eye on. Also, the suicide rates for women peak between the ages of 45 to 54 years old. So there's a small window of time there, and then also after age 75. So looking at age is a pretty important risk factor. But just in general, I think it's always good to keep this in mind with mental health treatment because individuals with mental illness or just with a lot of stress in their lives are at higher risk for suicide. So when is this helpful to assess? I think different places you'll work will have different recommendations for when to assess for suicide. Definitely if anyone ever mentions that they're having any thoughts, that's of course the time to assess. But I've found it very helpful in any intake it to be a very important part of an intake because not only is someone just imminently suicidal, but sometimes someone has chronic risk factors. You can see it coming a lot more, especially if they have past attempts, if they've had ideation in the past, things like that. So on my caseload, I work in a hospital setting. I actually have sort of an ongoing risk assessment for most of my patients. If they've ever had suicidal thoughts, I tend to do a safety plan in the intake. I tend to have a risk assessment I can carry over in the notes just to kind of protect myself and them to notice any changes in those factors. It adds a little bit more paperwork, so I've gotten to where I type very fast to get that done. But once you've done it once on intake, you can actually carry that over in your note and just adjust it, so it actually ends up not being much more work. And I've been told that that's a lot easier. I know a lot of clinicians that are kind of blindsided later when someone goes into crisis and they have to create that risk assessment from scratch. And it's a lot more stress. It's in the heat of the crisis and you're trying to figure all this out. So I recommend doing it on intake. If there's any changes, even patients who are pretty low risk for suicide, if they have a significant stressor happen or big change, I tend to just ask real briefly if they've had any thoughts or things like that. Other patients, they're at such high chronic risk, I'll ask them every session. And they've gotten to where they're very good at knowing. I've had even some come in and at the beginning of the session will just say, no thoughts in the last week, I'm doing fine, and then we can get on to everything else. But I see other clinicians that sometimes focus on other areas, and then at the end of session, it comes out that they're actually had a crisis or tried to kill themselves the last week. And if I hadn't asked specifically, they wouldn't have brought that up because they don't want to talk about it a lot of times. They feel bad, they feel embarrassed. And so if you're not comfortable talking about it as a clinician, a lot of times then they're not going to bring it up. So countless times I've had patients where I've seen for intake or I've seen transferred from another provider and they've had a whole wealth of suicide attempts in the past and there's not much risk assessment, there's not much documentation in the chart. And even liability wise, I attended a training where the trainer, I'll talk about him in just a second, he was saying that if you haven't mentioned it in your note and you haven't assessed for it, you're more liable if something does happen. If you've asked about it in the last week in your intake and you've done the proper response to it, then you're much less liable if something ever did happen. And also, actually the training I went to was a really exciting training. It was on a type of therapy for suicide risk. It was called brief cognitive behavioral therapy. It was actually for suicidal soldiers because I have worked with quite a few in the military. It was actually Craig Bryan. He works in the military. He's trying to help all of their risk assessment and safety planning. And they've developed a 12-week protocol that really focuses on lowering suicide risk. So a lot of the elements I'll be talking about will actually be using a lot of the things that he recommends. Another reason I wanted to mention him is the first handout that I provided how the suicidal mode develops for patients. For a lot of us, we don't really understand how could someone become suicidal? Why would they, especially if they're of faith, especially if they have so many good things in their life, why would they become suicidal? And so he uses this cognitive behavioral therapy model to understand what goes on in that crisis mode. Because even afterward, patients are very surprised at how did I attempt suicide? How did that happen? They don't want to understand and look at it because it's very distressing. But then later they're set up for those same patterns to kind of continue to happen. And also, if you take a look at that first paper, it's just a picture of the suicidal mode. And I actually will draw this on a board for patients and talk about, hey, in this last time you attempted, what went on for you? Let's kind of fill in the blanks here to kind of understand it. So as you first of all see predispositions to suicide, there's just kind of a brief list on here that Craig Bryan suggests. There's genetic and biological factors, family history of suicide that raises the likelihood of someone considering that or completing that. Also, abuse or other trauma. Most of my patients in the hospital setting have countless traumas of all different types, and so it makes sense that we have a higher risk for suicide population. Impulsivity, if they don't think before they act, kind of get a thought in their mind, they just do it, they're much more likely to attempt suicide. A lot of times, if they're more aggressive towards others, a lot of times that's a risk factor as well for aggression towards themselves. Previous suicidal behaviors is a big one. I have a patient right now who's attempted 15 to 20 times. It's amazing that she's still alive, and she's been flagged in our system for high risk for suicide. I think a couple months ago she'd attempted 3 different times in the same night. And as I'm telling stories about patients, I usually change some of the details and everything just for confidentiality reasons. But she's one I'm learning quite a bit from. And definitely with her amount of attempts in the past, that makes her one of the highest risk individuals I've probably ever seen. From medication she's taken, she actually had her gallbladder removed, and it's amazing the impact. Also psychiatric history, that's why in an intake you really want to figure out in the past, have they been hospitalized, have they been in crisis, do they self-harm? Because some people will also self-harm when they're not suicidal to distract themselves from pain. They'll cut, or I've had some inject themselves with needles, or even bang their head against the wall, or things like that to try to distract themselves from the pain. So that's another thing to assess. What was your intent when you did this to yourself? Because it is a little bit different if they actually wanted to die or if they kind of wanted to distract from the pain. So that's the predispositions to suicide. You'll see that those are very similar. We'll go into more depth when we look at the risk factors. But it's a combination of those predispositions of someone's more chronically at risk for suicide, and then they have a trigger. So on that diagram there, the next one is the trigger. These could be a job loss, relationship problems, financial stress, legal issues, especially loss of a significant other. I have a patient I haven't seen yet, but he's been referred to me, who his wife committed suicide by taking pills, and then he actually, I think a day later, took the same pills and tried to attempt suicide. So it's definitely a huge thing. So the combination of the predispositions or risk factors and then the trigger, that's why if you're noticing patients are having triggers or big changes, that could trigger them to go into this suicidal mode. So big reason to ask about that. And then that combination shoots over with the arrow to changes in thoughts, emotions, the physical body, and behavior. And so just the basic CBT model, I almost see it like a wheel kind of spinning. I think this is my own idea, but I think patients have really liked kind of that analogy of the ball rolling that gets the wheel going. And the more that they have negative changes in these 4 areas, the more they start getting more out of control. They're not thinking clearly. As you can see under the thoughts, they feel more hopeless, more of a burden. They start thinking more about reasons for dying above reasons for living. They don't really have problem-solving skills, so a lot of times they don't think of the options to solve whatever the stressor is, and they just go for the option of dying or committing suicide to escape. So that's where, in the heat of the moment, they're not thinking clearly. That's why people sometimes do attempt or do things that are pretty impulsive. The next one, emotions, could be any variety of emotions, but especially shame or guilt, anger, anxiety or panic, depression, all those kind of things. And the more the thoughts are more difficult or negative, the more the emotions are going to be more extreme. Also, a lot of times they won't be able to sleep, they can't eat, physiologically there's a lot of changes that then they're not really getting their physical needs met, which make them more at risk for really going into crisis. Also physical pain, probably the majority of my patients have pretty excessive chronic pain, so that could be a big trigger for them and ongoing stress. And the more they're stressed out, the more their pain is difficult. So those are kind of those 3 areas, and then the behaviors, then those change. A lot of times they're abusing substances, which really amps up their risk level. Actually, the same patient I was talking about, she said that alcohol is a weapon for her, so she'll intentionally get very intoxicated so that she will be able to try to drown herself or try to do other things to kill herself. Of course, then she doesn't see it as a risk factor when she's just drinking other times, so she has a hard time with me trying to work with her using motivational interviewing to lower her use. But she's identified that that is a risk factor. Also rehearsing it. A lot of times patients maybe will have a fear of dying or a fear of actually going through with it, but they'll start actually rehearsing putting a gun up to the head, which that can be considered an attempt because guns are so lethal. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But they'll start planning it ahead. The more that I see this wheel start spinning, the more they start planning it, the more they start really practicing it, which makes it that much easier to do. That's why if someone has already attempted in the past, they're that much more likely to fall into that pattern much more quickly. They've already done it before. And the way that clinicians a lot of times look at level of risk in the moment is, I see it like a ladder. The lowest level is I just have a wish I was dead. So more, we call it like a passive death wish or passive suicidal thoughts. The next level is an active thought. So it's when you actively are like, I'd like to do something to myself, but I don't know what that is. The next level is I actually have a plan. So I actually have thought through, I have a plan. I have some patients that have probably 10 different plans. The next level is if you have the means to do the plan. Definitely guns are the most lethal, most quick, and so that's the highest risk if they have a gun. But then there's many other creative ways that people can harm themselves, especially working with certain populations if they've had a lot of experience in really high lethal environments like military population, gang population, things like that. They've thought through some of these things before. That's when you actually are considering hospitalization. And there's a difference between more involuntary hospitalization and voluntary. Involuntary is when if you let the person go, you're pretty sure they're going to do something. That's when a lot of times in my clinic, we actually have some police that come in that are trained to work with mental health, and they do a final assessment to determine, can we force this person to go to the hospital? If it's lower than that and you don't have the justification that they're an imminent risk, then you can a lot of times recommend hospitalization. So really try to talk them up to going to the hospital themselves and checking themselves in. But that's always a very difficult assessment right there, and that's why it's always great to consult at that point with as many providers as you can. So that's kind of the different levels of how that can go. So this is just kind of a nice picture, and I think it's a great picture to use with clients too, because you can draw it on the board. You can say, hey, in that last time you attempted suicide, what was going on for you in the trigger? What was going on for you in your thoughts, feelings, your body, and your behavior? We're going to talk later today about safety planning and how to actually use this model to help them plan ahead, help them be able to use coping skills and things to get out of the crisis. And the next handout I have is a basic suicide risk assessment. And this is one you can just have in your note. Different systems you might work in might have different requirements, so use whatever is recommended, but this just kind of basically goes into one. It's one I use at work all the time. The first one is, do they have any ideation, intent, or plan? Basically, just are they currently having any suicidal thoughts? Some providers will just ask, today, right now, do you have any suicidal thoughts? The person will say no, and they just go about their day and they work on their relationships or whatever. I'm a little more conservative that I'll ask, since the last time I saw you, have you had any thoughts? Or if it's a new patient, I collect more of a detailed history of what does it look day to day for this person? Is it that it's been 5 years since they've had any suicidal thoughts, or is it more chronic that they face it all the time but they don't really act on it? Just getting that thorough history. When I carry on the risk assessment in my note, I'll just keep adding details. So I'll put on this date, this person denied current suicidal thoughts. They reported 2 thoughts in the last week without intent or plan. So I'll just kind of keep that going and then just keep adding to it. That way when you look at the risk assessment, it's pretty lengthy. I think people think I write pretty long notes. But you can see, okay, this is sort of their baseline. And then you can see, okay, it's increasing, it's getting much more frequent, much more intense. So let's amp up treatment, let's get them in more frequently, let's look at their medications, let's do all these things to try to deal with the crisis before it happens. So I'm conservative, a lot of people don't take that time to do that, but once you've done the work in the intake, it really doesn't take that much. So also, then you start looking at any recent hospitalizations. The system I work in has added to the required risk assessment, in the last 6 months, have there been hospitalizations or attempts? Because if it's been recent, they're much more high risk for that. And then also, what's their total number of attempts or hospitalizations? With the one patient I was telling you about, it definitely took us quite a long time to detail every single attempt she's had and every hospitalization. And there was even some that she had forgotten about or she couldn't remember a whole lot about. And she was like, oh, I found a rope in the attic once, and I realized I just left it hanging there from the last time I used it. But I think sometimes also patients will use provocative language to try to pull you in. So it's always that balance of, are they getting something out of telling the story and they're almost could be making stuff up, or are they also truthful? And I think this patient's one of the hardest because there's that provocative way of her talking about it, but then on the other hand, she has all the attempts, so it's not all talk. So it's a nice little balance there. But the next thing is looking at the different risk factors. So static risk factors are ones that don't change over time. They're more historical. They're ones that add to the chronic level of risk for that person. You can't really change them with treatment because it's age, or it's male is more at risk for completions. Women is usually more at risk for a number of attempts, but maybe they don't attempt in as many lethal ways. So our next handout you can take a look at as you keep this one out. This is just a nice list of static and dynamic risk factors. History of suicide attempt, and also family history of suicide attempt. That's things that don't change over time. We can't address them with treatment, but it's something to keep in mind. History of mental disorder, history of substance abuse, history of abuse or trauma, especially sexual abuse. Male, 65 and over is one of the age groups that's at risk. Caucasian is a risk factor. history of impulsivity, also losses, especially employment, especially with our economy, how it's been in the last few years, and there's a lot of difficulty with employment, physical losses, loss of functioning as people age or have medical issues, things like that. Also legal issues, history of combat exposure or really traumatic physical altercations or things like that. Also, we put on here TBI, that's traumatic brain injury, so if someone has a history of head injuries, that can be a risk factor. So in your risk assessment, you would put any of those things under static. You might have somebody who currently is doing okay, but they have a lot of static risk factors, so you still keep an eye on them because at any point they might go into crisis. And the other part is dynamic risk factors. These are ones you try to address with treatment. So you really try to see if you can work on these things. Actually, at the bottom of the risk assessment, you can see suicide risk reduction plan to address dynamic factors. So that's where you're really trying to work on how can I help this person work on these areas so that they are less likely to go into crisis. So for example, living alone is a risk factor because also if they attempt, someone might not find them, they might not be there to help them through that. Feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, poor social support, unemployment, feeling humiliated or shamed. We have readjustment problems. That's for if someone's going through a really big change recently, or also like for military if they're coming back from deployment, things like that. Substance use. A lot of times we'll try to recommend substance abuse treatment and everything right at the beginning when someone's trying to work on their risk level. Access to lethal means, that's one of the big ones that I really am a huge proponent of. We're going to talk about that in just a second, of means restriction, but that makes a huge difference in whether someone attempts or not having that access. If they don't have access, they're much less likely to act on it because it takes a lot of thinking through how do I kill myself. If there's a loaded gun right there, they don't have to think that through. They're going to potentially go for it. Let's see, chronic pain. We've talked about a lot of these things. And so anything affecting the stress level of the person can really amp that up. Also, I attended a training recently that talked about spiritual struggles and everything can be a risk factor. When someone is going through a difficulty in their relationship with God or relationship with other people, that could be a big risk factor. Conversely, if someone is really feeling a lot of support from their relationship with God or from their community, then that's a very big protective factor for them. So the next one is actually protective factors, just thinking of what things can help someone get through, especially reasons for living. So that could be family members, that could be their faith, also pets. I mean, I have so many patients that are like, because of my dog is why I continue to get up in the morning. We don't have that one listed out, but just kind of anything positive that can really help a person. Also access to clinical care, motivation for treatment, just anything that would really protect someone when they're in crisis. Also, if they restrict access to means, that's a protective factor, or if they're not abusing substances. If the opposite of the risk factors is the protective factors. On this risk assessment, there's also any other relevant factors, so that anything else that you as a clinician wants to add in that you think really is important to have in that risk assessment. All of this weighing out of all these factors is to get to the next one, which is the clinician's overall analysis. So that's where you actually put in what is a person's short-term risk for suicide, what's a person's long-term risk. So short term would be today, after I let them go from this appointment, what is their likelihood of doing something to themselves? And you can explain why you put that. For example, I might put low to moderate because the person is engaged in treatment and they have gotten rid of their gun, but they still haven't gotten rid of access to knives or something like that. I'm just kind of weighing out those factors. Or they told me today they would never kill themselves because they're grandchild, and so they have strong protective factors, but they still have 5 past attempts. So just kind of weighing out those options. Short term is more imminent. Long term is more, throughout this person's life, is there more likelihood that they might attempt again? So a lot of times I'll have low to moderate for short term, but then if they do have a lot of historical reasons for probably attempting, I might put moderate. When you're getting to the more of the high level, that's when you're considering hospitalization. If you ever put short term is high, then you want to make sure that you're considering hospitalization, or you followed up, or you have recommended all those things. I rarely would put high unless I'm sending the person over to the hospital right then. Sometimes for long term, I might put moderate to high. Like for my person I was mentioning that has that many past attempts. Just looking at history alone, she may be doing fine now, but what's to say in a week or two she may not be. And then after that, you put immediate safety needs. That's especially if you're going to hospitalize someone. You would say immediate safety needs are inpatient hospitalization. If the person is not at that point, I might put there's no immediate safety needs, but we're working on a safety plan so that they can make it okay over the next few weeks. And so we're going to go over that safety plan in a little bit. They also have most appropriate setting for treatment, inpatient versus outpatient. Or you could put in substance abuse treatment or psychiatry or something like that. Finally is the risk reduction plan. And that's where I would usually mention individual therapy about at this frequency, recommended our partial hospitalization program, recommended substance abuse treatment, kind of all the things that I would recommend to reduce their risk. So that's what you would put down there. Sometimes the people are not willing to do that, so that's when you still put you recommended it, because even if they refuse to it, you still want to document that you've offered a wealth of services for them. That way, in case they don't do that and then they do and end up attempting, you've showed that you've offered all the treatment. So the more you put in your note, I think the more you're better off for liability reasons. So that's kind of just the basic suicide risk assessment. You can go into it more detailed or less detailed, but just having it in there is the biggest thing for liability reasons, because it's showing that you're thinking about that and you're assessing the level of risk. I've had some trainees I've worked with where they put everything in the note, but they don't title it risk assessment. They don't put this person's short and long-term risk, and they've done all the work, but they don't do the final step. And so that still could leave them open to a question of, did you assess their risk level and everything? So kind of following a template can be very helpful. We're going to move on now to safety planning, just so that you have an idea as a clinician, what can I do? Because sometimes it's very difficult when you're looking at the level of risk and you're like, what can I do here? And it can be very stressful working with individuals in crisis and everything. I think there is almost an exposure part of it. The more you do it, the more you get comfortable with it. So I've gotten to the point that no matter what someone tells me, I think I probably heard something similar before. So I'm much more comfortable over time. Some clinicians will avoid the whole thing because I think they haven't become comfortable with it. And so even unknowingly, they're not intending to, but they are not comfortable talking about, so patients won't want to bring it up. And both the patient and the clinician avoid it, and then they're not prepared if something happens. So I think the more you do it, the more it becomes easy. I just whip one of these out in like 5 minutes usually. Same with the safety plan, and that's the next part here, which is this personalized coping safety plan. This is a template I created on my internship when I was working in an inpatient setting and was doing so many safety plans that I was like, why not create a template so you have a nice handout to give the patient? Whereas before it was something that you would enter in the computer, it wasn't very user-friendly. You would try to print it out, the printer wouldn't work, it was like, so I've actually disseminated this to, I think, people all over my hospital, and then also I've heard that they've been sending it to other hospitals and stuff because it just is so easy to use. So just a page front and back, and you just go through all these required elements in our system for safety plan, but I've also included a lot of other coping tools. So the first thing is looking at warning signs or triggers. So helping the patient identify what to them helps them see that they're rising their level of risk. You could look at the static and dynamic factors to see if any of those would be warning signs or triggers. It could be anything. So helping them identify and putting in their own words and putting on here. And then once they see the warning signs, then realizing when the above warning signs occur, I will do the following, getting a step-by-step plan. Because as we mentioned, when they start to go into crisis, they're not thinking clearly. Coming up with ideas is not possible at that point for the most part. So you have it already planned ahead when they're calmer with things that will work for them. So these are just basic ones on here, watching a movie, listening to music, taking a nap, working out, very basic things, but then helping the person choose which things might work for them, crossing things off the list if it doesn't work. For example, if there's certain types of music that actually make them feel more emotional and more distressed, we don't want them listening to those songs. Heavy metal or things like that may not help them calm down. So we talk with them about what's helpful, what's not. And always helping them think through, is this going to amp me up more? Is this going to put the brakes on that wheel for me? Also going to the social settings, sometimes getting out of the house, getting out of isolation, that really can help. So I just have a few examples of places they can go, but some people will say going fishing, some people will say going to a coffee shop, whatever it is to get out of the house and things like that. But you do want to make sure that when they're doing that it's safe. Like if the person has thoughts of crashing their car, you probably don't want them driving places. It's just helping them think through, because a lot of times they're not really thinking logically, or they don't have a lot of insight into that. So these are some of the basic things. Also relaxation and meditation is a huge resource. So there's a description on this handout of how to do deep, slow breathing, can calm people down. I've done groups before or individually, and we do 5 minutes of this, and they say that their stress level goes from like an 8 to a 7 or 8 to a 6 or even much lower. But even if it's a little bit, we'll take it. Some people say it really makes a big difference. We also do say, one of my colleagues brought up the analogy of Shaq trying to do free throws, and if he only did them during the game, he would never get good at them. He had to practice and get much better when times are easier and not so much stress, so that he can do it in the moment. And so really making sure people are trying these things when they're not in crisis, because otherwise they're not going to work in crisis. And I think the analogy of the wheel spinning, if it's 100 miles an hour, the brakes are not going to work nearly as well. If it's 50 miles an hour and you've caught it a little bit sooner, then you can put the brakes on and they work much better. Because I did a group recently and a higher risk patient was like, well, that coping plan is not going to work. If I try to do deep breathing when I'm in crisis, that's not going to help at all. And trying to explain, you want to practice this all the time so that you can then rely on it more. Or if it only takes it down a notch, try something else on the list. Do a combination. There's also progressive muscle relaxation, tensing and relaxing your muscles. And I did this with a group of high-risk patients, and they said it really helped to calm them down, even 5-10 minutes of it. Also visualizing, like if someone likes to go fishing, hey, instead, if you can't go fishing all the time, picture what it's like to go fishing. Picture the 5 senses, what it looks like, sounds like, smells like, any of those things, and picture that. I have on here some different online resources. It's amazing how technology is impacting this, that just in the last few years, people are able on their smartphones to pull up all these different tools. There's tons of free apps with relaxation, meditation. I think that they're actually coming out with some with even a safety plan on an app. And then pulling those things up are so much easier. They're with the person at all times. That's a pretty big part of it. There's a few websites on here that you can check out or recommendations for free apps, but there's so much out there, just they can even Google it or look it up. Let's see, a few other things, even self-soothing, so using any of the 5 senses to calm down. So if something smells good, I had a patient who kept some coffee beans in his pocket. When he was stressed out, he just smelled them, and somehow that helped him feel better. Whatever it is. I had another guy that had one of those smooth rocks he would feel and everything. But then other people in the group, this was in an anger management group, they're like, well, I'd probably throw the rock at somebody. So we're like, well, maybe don't put that on your coping plan. So thinking through all that and everything. Looking at photos of friends and family, that's a pretty big one. That actually goes along with one of the other aspects in the training I went to of really creating a list of reasons for living. And not only thinking of that, creating cards actually, so you can just take 3x5 cards and actually writing down what are my reasons for living, who is on that list, and also picturing milestones in the future with that person. Like I'd like to be there for my granddaughter's graduation or her getting married or something in the future to help them be more future oriented and really think of positive things in the future. Also, if they have a dream that they've always wanted to travel somewhere, putting those things on there so that they're focusing. And I've had some patients that actually have pulled that out, and that's what really helped them. Or having those photos. Again, technology can really be helpful. All of this stuff can go into what we call a coping kit. So in the training I went to recently, also recommended not only having a paper that has the coping plan, but actually having a tangible coping kit. So like a box or a basket at home where you put in elements of the coping plan. So you could have, if you like going and walking the dog to feel better, put the leash in the basket. If you have photos, if you have inspirational little cards. I had a pretty high-risk veteran tell me that he actually keeps a text. Someone had texted him a really nice text telling them how much he meant to them, and he reads that every once in a while. So just anything in there, you can have a tangible box at home, and you can also have your phone or cards or papers in your wallet to take with you. That way, no matter where you are, you have your coping safety plan. And there is something about having tangible things in there. Putting some lotion in there that smells good. Putting in a video or a DVD of something you want to watch. Especially with your faith, that could be a very strong thing, putting Bible verses in or putting in things that are inspirational and all. Also on this coping plan, there's having positive self-talk. So even on the cards, you can put, I can get through this. Look how much I've survived in my life. Even if I feel like I'm a burden, I know my friends and family would be devastated if I was dead. Things to really challenge those negative thoughts and having those at your fingertips, because they're probably not going to come up with those thoughts when they're in the middle of a crisis. Also, it's important to have people to reach out to. So having a whole range of people to reach out to, everything from I don't tell them anything about my crisis, but I can go hang out with them and we can feel better because I'm not comfortable maybe telling them about that, all the way to I tell someone I'm in crisis and they help me go to the hospital. So having a range of people that they can feel comfortable. I have many patients who are like, I have nobody on that list. And that really shows you that building their social support is a pretty big part of treatment. Also, they can have pastors, sponsors, if they're in AA or NA. They can have just anybody that they can reach out to on that list. Sometimes even on your phone, having a special list of people in your phone that you can just hit a button and reach out, because the easier you make it on them, the more likely they're going to do it. You can also have your contact information. You want to make sure that they have a plan of what to do if they can't reach you, though, because I have gotten some messages on my phone. There was one I got, I think, on Friday at 4:15 of someone basically saying goodbye and everything. And so that was very stressful. I couldn't reach him. I actually sent a welfare check in the whole week, and I didn't know if he was okay. And he actually was, but he said that the police came, and that's why he didn't do anything. And so on my voicemail recording, I have, if you're having any thoughts of harming yourself, call the suicide hotline number or go to the ER. We're starting to possibly have email access, and that's a concern I have of someone sending an email off, and then you later get it, and then you're sifting through to try to assess. So those are things that you want to have a check-in with whatever system you work in. And then there's a national crisis hotline. I don't know if people have heard of that before. It's really helpful. We use it a lot in our system, but anybody can use it. And actually in our system, they've come up with all these different paraphernalia. We have little keychains, we have bracelets, things like that that we can give out that have that crisis hotline number. And so people do a lot of times call that. Also going to the nearest ER or 911, any of those things. That way in the heat of the moment, they can reach out. So I always tell them you can keep me posted on how you're doing, but I may not get the message. And if you're in crisis, to reach out immediately to crisis resources. They actually have, with the hotline number, you can actually text or chat online. They've opened it up to more technology, so people sometimes don't feel comfortable talking to somebody, but they can send a text or they can send a chat. Some of them, I think you can keep it confidential, which makes it harder for them to send help if they need to, but sometimes people feel more comfortable just confidentially, without giving their name, talking to somebody. So that's just in a nutshell, a really easy coping safety plan. And then what I do is I just put a copy into the chart. That way it's in there. And then in the future, if someone goes into crisis, I'll tell them, hey, remember on intake, we did this plan, let's pull that out, or I can give you another copy and let's review that, versus they're in crisis, we've never done a safety plan, we've never looked at this, and then I'm doing like a new risk assessment, new safety plan, and it's very stressful. And then the other area, as we're finishing up, is I really wanted to go over means restriction and everything. That's a very big part of helping people work through their crisis but not act on the thoughts. Some of the training I went through said that the availability of means is perhaps the most important determinant of methodology. So meaning that if it's available, they're more likely to use it. That's going to really help make the decision. So if a gun's there, they're more likely to use a gun. It can be a tricky subject for some people with gun rights and things like that, but just talking with them about the risks, if they choose to keep it, you just keep that in your risk assessment that they still have that, and that flavors what you do with them. And actually, self-inflicted gunshot wound is fatal 85% of the time. That shows that if it's available, they might use it. And a lot of people in the last moment, they actually change their mind or they don't want to do it, but it's too late by that point. Whereas if they took pills, they could go to the hospital, they could call someone, they could reach out. That's why I think talking about gun safety, I do it with every patient, no matter if they're high risk or not. I just do it at the beginning. Sometimes planting those seeds, because they a lot of times at the beginning don't want to get rid of that. But then I've had several patients that I worked with them, I knew they're at higher risk, and we tried it, and then I had a patient who was like, well, last week I had the gun in my mouth. I guess maybe we do want to talk about this. So at least I'd planted those seeds. That same individual then, he decided to get rid of the bullets. Our hospital actually provides gun locks, so I actually keep a box in my office. I actually went through a whole box of these about a month ago. What it is it's actually from Project Child Safe, so I think they might give those out to increase gun safety in the home, but our hospital, we just give them out. I'll have some individuals come after group, can I have 5 gun locks? I'm like, sure. The best thing is if they don't have the firearm at all. That's ideal. But if they're not willing to get rid of it, the next best thing is to not have any access to it. So giving them a gun lock and then confirming with their significant other that they don't have access to the combination or the key. So this comes with 2 keys, making sure the spouse has both keys so that in the heat of the moment, they can't get to it without going through the other person. Also, a lot of people like having them in a safe, so that's even better, not knowing the combination. The one patient I had brought up, her husband has a huge safe of probably like 20 guns or something. And then also she puts the medication, she puts other things in the safe so that she doesn't have access to any of it. And so these are all things that you really can use to kind of help out. And so it's easier if you can work out that safety plan, give them a gun lock in session, they're more likely to use it versus going out and buying one for themselves. So that's kind of the basic with means restriction. With guns, that's the most important. But then also with anything else, if they've ever had a plan to use anything else, you really want to work with them to try to reduce that. Sometimes we have the spouse lock away the kitchen knives. If they have steak that day, they get out the kitchen knives, but they don't just have them out there. Some things you really can't limit. Somebody had a thing of gasoline that they had in their garage. It's becoming more common for people to actually burn themselves. So really having him get the gasoline out of there so that it's not just easy to use at that point. There's the carbon monoxide poisoning with the car in the garage, figuring out how to limit any of the things that would be used for that. Bombs, anything else. So just trying to help work with them with also restricting medications. If someone's been flagged for high risk for suicide in our system, they automatically limit the medications to 2-week supply, and then trying to see do they have any other excess medication that they might have around. That can include aspirin, Tylenol, stuff like that. So really trying to work with them on the front end, but still doing it in a way that supports their freedom, because the more that you try to get someone to do something and they feel controlled, the less likely they're going to do it. I go into a lot of detail with that, but I think the more you do that, the more those seeds are planted, so the person's more likely to do it. But I'm constantly getting patients that have been in treatment for 10 years, and there's no documentation if they have guns, and you find out they have a whole arsenal, and they're at risk for a lot of different things, so always makes it fun. Anyway, I think that covers the majority of suicide risk assessment and safety planning. But I feel like if you're going to focus on one thing in mental health treatment, risk for suicide or homicide is the one area of mental health treatment that really can change lives and could prevent someone from killing themselves. And so this is something that I think the more we can focus on, once we have this done, then you can focus on other areas that are very important as well. But by focus on this first, it kind of creates that hierarchy. And then if in treatment someone goes into crisis, you can then just return to these skills you've been working on versus having to create it. So I'll end there. Dear God, I really thank you for this opportunity to talk about something that is so difficult and that it touches so many lives and is just really devastating for so many, no matter if you're a person dealing with suicidal thoughts or a family member or friend. And I just really pray that this information is able to go out and be used and that it'll get to the right people who need it. And I pray that everything makes sense or will become clear as it's being used. And thank you for this time. In Jesus' name, amen.